the borders of the sea. Was in Marion, North Carolina, in a little mountain town. 5 workers of the textile in cold blood were shot down. Is there the same old story with the laborers of our land? They're ruled by mighty power and riches.
Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to episode 11 of Rednecks Rising, the anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-fascist Appalachian podcast where we dig into and dispel the caricatures of Appalachians and explore our radical roots in revolutionary resistance. I'm your host, Chelsea, and I'm excited to have you on board this journey with me throughout history and to have you along to meet my neighbors across the mountain range through our interviews where we learn about their work in mutual aid, legal aid, abortion access, education, community organizing, and so much more. Today, we're covering a story that's local to me, actually. A story about events that took place in Marion, North Carolina. It's really around an hour from where I currently live, but fun little fact, I did live in Marion for a good bit when I was just a teeny bop. And I lived in one of the houses that used to be owned by the mill company that I'm going to talk about in this story. So this story was a fun one for me to research, and I'm really excited to share it with y'all. And even though I grew up in and around McDowell County, which is where Marion is located in North Carolina, for my whole life, this was a story that I had never heard of until a friend of mine that's local to Marion, shout out Jacob, brought it to my attention and suggested that I cover it on the show. I really want to have Jacob on eventually to give his rendition of the story as a local, but I put out a poll to see what y'all wanted to hear about this week in particular, and this topic was the winner. So we'll have to do another episode on this that goes a little bit deeper with Jacob later on, but we need some time to get that arranged and for our schedules to align and all of that fun stuff. Speaking of which, that's actually a great segue into some housekeeping business. If you want to vote in these polls that I speak of and help decide which episodes we should cover on the show, that is one of the sweet perks that you get access to when you become a monthly supporter over on our Ko-Fi page. That page is kind of like a Patreon if you're familiar with that, and monthly support on that page starts at as little as $1 per month, giving you access to those supporter-only polls, to our Discord server, and some more fun stuff. You can also make a one-time contribution to the show if monthly subscriptions aren't really your thing, or you could also find some sweet merch over there that you can wear and essentially provide us with advertising while also getting questions about your anti-racist and Appalachian hat. That is spelled KO, like knockout, -fi.com/rednecksrising, all one word, just like it's spelled in the name of the podcast. And the best part is we take half the profits that come in from the members who support the show, and we put those towards groups that are doing the work in the trenches. And the folks who listen to and come on to this show are just truly magical. And we've been receiving financial support from y'all since before the show even launched in mid-June. And between then and the end of July, we have brought in just over $450 of contributions from our supporters, which is wild. As a brand new podcast, it is actually kind of hard for me to believe that we brought in that much support in less than 60 days. And that's just the financial support. That's not to mention all of the moral support and solidarity that's a lot harder to quantify, that's been expressed in so many other ways. And that has been also so important for giving me the drive and the motivation to show up every week and do this work. And it's also made it possible for me to connect with some of the badass folks that we've had on the show. And so that over $450, that is not the profits, that is the total income. But I want to be transparent about like how much money y'all are contributing and where that money's going and what all the numbers come out to be. And so that income represents all of the merch that was purchased, and any one-time or monthly contributions that were sent in. And in that same period of time, we spent just under $250 on the podcast. That money went towards things like the wholesale cost of producing the merch. So, while we brought in maybe like you buy a shirt for $20, like actually the wholesale cost of producing that shirt is like $14, right? And then the subscription to our podcast distribution service that we're paying for on a monthly basis, and then an annual membership fee to our Ko-Fi page, which Ko-Fi doesn't actually take any fees from y'all's contributions, and we're not going to have to pay that membership fee again until next year. So that works out really well. And anyways, all in all, it works out so that we are able to donate just over $100 to our friends at the Pulaski County Free Store, who we interviewed in our second episode on the pod and who just really blew us out of the water. So I cannot thank you enough so much for your support in every shape and size, both for making this podcast possible and for allowing us to pass on that support to our comrades throughout Appalachia. Another piece of housekeeping business that I'm actually really excited to be sharing with y'all is that I will be dropping our first bonus episode as a podcast this week. The episode is going to be featuring an interview with our friends over at the Power Coalition, and that is spelled POWHR. It stands for Protecting Our Water, Heritage, and Rights. And in that interview, we had a conversation that really just left me feeling so fired up that I couldn't even wait to drop it. And so y'all, if you're not already, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast on whatever streaming service that you use so that you get an alert later this week when that surprise bonus episode comes out. Now, I don't want to give too much away, but basically it all boils down to the government's strategic sabotage of Appalachia, indigenous lands, and communities of color, and an opportunity for us to take action right now in this moment. I also, as another piece of housekeeping business, am going to be doing a giveaway soon, but I haven't figured out the details on that. So just consider this a little teaser, a bonus tease in addition to the teaser of the bonus episode, and stay tuned for more to come on both of those. All right. I think that wraps up just about everything that I needed to touch on before we dig into today's story. But first, you know what time it is. Let's hear our trivia question of the day.
Hey, Chelsea.
Hey, Chris.
So the Appalachian Mountains are known for having a lot of tunnels that are all over the place. So for today's question, what is the largest tunnel in the Appalachian Mountains?
This is a good question. I'm excited to hear the answer. For those of you listening, and for me, you'll have to listen to the end of the episode to find out the answer. For now, let's dig in. And before we dig in, I want to offer a disclaimer that I am by no means an expert on this story, and it's practically inevitable that I will get some things wrong. So I apologize in advance. I am ready for y'all to let me learn from you if you know more than I do on this. And I am also really excited to bring in folks like Jacob who do for a fact know more than me about this story. But I'm going to share with you what I was able to find out from the technology that is available to me in this here 21st century.
Was in Marion, North Carolina, in a little mountain town.
Once I actually got into this story and started researching it, I was shocked that this massacre was such a well-kept secret across our mountain communities. There's a couple of theories that come up in some of the very little recent coverage of the event, and those theories as to why this story has been all but forgotten touch on the shame that comes from the tragic end of this story. They touch on the intentional erasure of history in order to suppress future organizing efforts, and they touch on just a little bit of everything in between. And at the time of the event, it was actually receiving national attention. It was even being covered by the likes of Sinclair Lewis. But even to gather enough information to put together a well-informed episode for y'all that didn't have like major gaps in it, I spent a ton of time just digging through straight up like old newspaper articles from the 1920s, because so much evidence of the entire situation has been erased. So this isn't part of our race and labor 4-part series that we wrapped up, wrapped up for now. I'll probably come back to it at some point because such is the way of ADHD. But even though this isn't a part of that 4-part series, it's really conveniently timed for me to cover this because it's actually taking place around the same time as the whole mine wars up in West Virginia were building in urgency and tension. So just a little ways south of West Virginia, just down the Appalachian Mountain Range, tensions here were also building in the area, in particular of McDowell County in western North Carolina, where many textile mills had taken up their roots and taken over towns in much of the same way that the mine companies had taken over the towns in central Appalachia. In McDowell County, there were more than 3 mills, but there were 3 predominant mills around 1921. And there has been so much of the evidence of this story that has been lost, like I've already mentioned. But even though that is the case, some artifacts were salvaged from the old manufacturing building in recent years prior to the building being destroyed. And one of those artifacts was a moldy ledger that showed that the mill had a budget in 1921 of around $1.3 million per year, which is fucking bonkers for a mill in McDowell County in the early 1920s to be bringing in that much money, even a successful mill. But of course, it should come as no surprise to those of us who have been following along with the episodes up to this point, because we should be all too familiar with the horrendous treatment of workers in the mines. And we should also all know that that horrendous treatment was not unique to the mines. Of course, that horrendous treatment was learned from, the slave owners and the colonizers' brutal violence towards indigenous peoples and African Americans. And knowing that, of course, it's no surprise that the workers weren't sharing in the benefits of that massive budget. In fact, workers were making just over maybe $10 per week before money was taken from their wages to cover the cost of their company-owned housing and whatever purchases they charged at the company store. And you did hear me right. Mill towns, like mine towns, were fully owned and operated by the corporate oligarchs of the era. Workers couldn't simply just go to work and go home and be free from their employer. But no, the abuses of their employer extended well into the homes, and entire towns were owned by the companies. Southern mills were already known for exercising a standard of practice that really maximized exploitation with long days and low pays. And among those mills, the Marion plant was said to have some of the worst working conditions in the entire region. I was reading one old newspaper clip that described Marion as being full of drab gray houses without cellars or screens, strung along a dusty, winding road. The houses were cheaply constructed, drably painted, and they didn't have sewage, running water, or baths. The main road in East Marion was named Baldwin Avenue, which named after the president of the East Marion Manufacturing Company, where the people of the town would make their way to work at the crack of dawn. Children, parents, and grandparents all would wake up together and trudge together to go to work. The mill village in East Marion was apparently ugly enough that the workers expressed their feelings, how they felt about the town, in the names that they picked for some of the different areas, like Hogwaller, Tin Can Alley, Greasy Corners, Stumpy Hollow, and then there's one spot named sarcastically River Road because apparently the only nearby river was the road itself, which would be just filled with rushing water coming down the mountain every time it would rain. Houses in the village were rented for 20 cents per room per week. The company store also housed the post office, and the material necessities that the company store sold were available for prices that were roughly like 20 to 25% higher than the private stores that were few and far between in the area. So you can probably imagine that all of these things considered, the area was ripe for union organizing by 1929, when an article was published by John A. Peel, an organizer with the United Textile Workers of America. And in this article, John declared that, quote, "Never in the state of North Carolina have the opportunities been as great for organizing the working people of all crafts. We will take the textile workers." And that same year, 1929, Alfred Hoffman was a young organizer with the American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers that went on to become the American Federation of Labor, AFL, Alfred had actually been previously kidnapped by an armed mob of corporate businessmen in Elizabethton, Tennessee during another strike of rayon workers out in their mills. So I need to learn more about that. I actually don't know anything about that story, so that's going to have to be a whole nother episode, but I am really excited to learn about it. But so this guy, Alfred Hoffman, who had this history in labor organizing and had been kidnapped literally by a capitalist for his work, at the same time that John Peel was writing his article, Alfred wrote an article declaring that, quote, "Hillbillies from the highlands of Tennessee and the Piedmont Carolinas will be the backbone of a bloodless uprising now gathering force through the new industrial South, which will be almost as significant as the Civil War itself. The hillbillies of Elizabethton gave the signal for the revolt. In Marion, North Carolina, in a cluster of hill villages, the spark has caught fire. The Union is spreading through these hill towns. We have never had the hill people in such large numbers in our mill villages fight before. The hill people are clannish. They will stick together. There is a racial solidarity remaining in these people, which is the stuff of which an invincible organization is built. These people are not yet broken to the routine of industry and will revolt where others will submit." End quote. Cool thing about researching using so many what's the word for it? Is it called a direct source? I can't remember what the word is when you're just reading straight from historical articles, But the cool thing about it is that there's lots of cool quotes that I get to bring into this story. So John Peel published his article, Alfred Hoffman published his article, and in mid-May of that year, the local newspaper announced that a definite drive to organize the textile workers in the 9 mills of Marion had officially been launched at an event where a public speech was given by Thomas F. McMahon, who was president of the United Textile Workers Union. And according to this local news article, the audience was very enthusiastic, and that audience consisted of textile workers and their friends, family, and supporters who filled every available foot of space in the McDowell County courthouse to hear McMahon discuss the conditions of the Southern mill workers and urge them to organize. But the effort to unionize, like any effort towards liberation in a system that has always been intended to protect and maintain white supremacist capitalism, Well, these efforts were never going to be easy for the union organizers. The union had to hold meetings in the backwoods, in deserted houses, and out-of-way hollers. The bosses burned gallons of gasoline, trailing them to wherever they would go, or wherever they could find them. The leaders of the union effort were fired from the mills. And as someone who's been fired from my job for organizing a union, I know what that's like personally. But what I don't know as a personal experience is the experience of receiving threatening letters like the union organizers did in Marion. Letters from the Ku Klux Klan with warnings, anonymous threats of all kinds. But our union leaders are strong, and that did not stop their efforts. Within a month of that announcement in the local paper about the dedicated drive to organize the mills in Marion, on the afternoon of July 11th, 1929, in response to those co-workers who were fired in retaliation for organizing with the union, about 600 employees of the Marion Manufacturing Company, which is basically all but 30 workers, more or less, from what I was reading, 600 employees staged a complete walkout in protest against those firings. 2 other large textile mills in McDowell County, the Cross and the Clinchfield, the other 2 major ones, were reportedly around 90% organized as well, and they were poised to join the ranks of those Marion manufacturing striking workers. And that would threaten to bring in another combined 1,500 workers from those 2 additional companies. Of course, the president of the manufacturing company, a Mr. R.W. Baldwin, which I know I've already said that the main road was named after him, but doesn't that just sound like the kind of monopoly man who would run a manufacturing company based in or rooted in exaggerated exploitation of Appalachia? Doesn't like just a perfect name, chef's kiss. So Baldwin claimed that the labor organizers and striking workers never made any attempt to talk to him. And he also, affirmed that he would not negotiate with labor organizers who did not work for him. So that same Alfred Hoffman, who I already mentioned for having been a longtime labor organizer, who's been around the block when it's come to anti-union harassment, who'd already published that one article, Alfred Hoffman issued a statement that I think, again, is just pretty awesome. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. Quote, "Let me first say that this strike is a spontaneous reaction to the terrible mill conditions which prevail in Marion. These men and women walked out of the mill when the management refused to agree to their eminently reasonable demands. They stopped work because the mill management refused to give them any consideration whatsoever in their demands to improve their own working conditions. Mr. Baldwin states that no effort has been made to see him since the workers left their machines on Thursday afternoon, but on Thursday morning and afternoon again, he refused every one of the major demands made by the workers. If Mr. Baldwin now desires to reconsider the questions proposed to him by the Workers' Grievance Committee, I know that the workers will meet him if he announces such a desire. When he says that 15 men and women were discharged for other reasons than union membership, it is well to note that each one of these persons was a pioneer in the union in his plant, and most of them are officers of the union in his mill. Mr. Pless of Asheville, a director of the Marion Manufacturing Company, announces that the mill is making no money. Market reports on the grade of goods manufactured in Marion show an increase in price and also lively sales. The workers, however, did not ask for a direct wage increase and offered assistance in reducing waste and reducing production costs. I am sorry that Mr. Pless places credence in the stupid rumor that northern manufacturers are financing this strike. 3 men and women came out knowing that a strike is a period of economic losses and of suffering. This strike is a struggle for a better living and not a subsidized vacation. Money for relief as well as food and clothing must come from friends of labor and of progress. 2 committees on 4 occasions called on President Baldwin, and each time they were scoffed at for their efforts to improve their livelihood. He boasted that they did not have the power to strike, and in a spirit of bravado offered them on one occasion $5 to pull a strike, and on Thursday morning, the day of the strike, raised his bid to $50, thus arousing the indignation and resentment of the workers. It is Mr. Baldwin who provoked this strike. For the benefit of an impartial public, I list what the workers asked for in their demands. First, reduction of hours from a 12-hour and 20-minute day shift and 11-hour and 20-minute night shift to a straight 10-hour day. No increase in wages was asked for. Second, reinstatement of those who were fired for joining the union. In return for this, the workers offered to assist in waste elimination and curbing of production costs for the mutual benefit of both interested parties. The workers are at any time willing and anxious to submit these points at issue to an impartial board of arbitration. End quote. On the morning of July 18th, 1 week from the walkout, Mr. Baldwin approached the mill property with a group of scabs in tow to do the work that wasn't being done by the workers who were on strike. So according to reports, the strikers reportedly agreed to let Mr. Baldwin onto the property, but refused to let the strikebreakers through their picket line. And that makes sense to me. I mean, it's his property, so you let him on, but can you blame them for not letting the strikebreakers through? I mean, they're literally undermining the whole point of the strike. And hello, can we just insert that South Park reference with the taking our jobs quote here? That whole narrative of anyone taking our job that has been wrongfully used to divide poor white folks from immigrants who are seeking opportunity and survival under capitalism. Like, that whole narrative wouldn't be necessary if capitalism didn't make us depend on these shitty ass jobs to start with. So anyways, they refused to let the strikebreakers through to take their jobs and undermine the strike. And apparently an argument ensued. And at some point, Mr. Baldwin, the president of the company, got hit on the head. So the strikers had their version of the story, which was that the scabs rushed the entrance to the mill to get in, and one of the gates at the entrance swung open in the process and hit Baldwin in the head. Baldwin's version of the story was that one of the strikers hit him in the head with a stick. Let's not forget that when it comes to the institutions that were created by white capitalists, those institutions will always serve to protect the power and wealth of white supremacist capitalism. And this has come up in so many episodes already, but here it comes again naturally because that's like the whole point of the show, right? In the end, 18 striking employees of the Marion Manufacturing Company at the end of this skirmish were arrested in that afternoon by Sheriff Adkins. We're going to come back to him, who had been issued warrants for their arrest by one of the local judges. The warrants charged the strikers with conspiracy to assault, beat, and wound R.W. Baldwin, president of the Marion Manufacturing Company, and other employees. During the trial of those strikers, the judge ruled ultimately that employers have a freedom of choice for employing and discharging their employees. And right to work, if you've ever heard of that, is essentially what he brings up. An employer may discharge an employee whenever he may desire without giving any explanation or reason for such discharge. And also then turns it around and says, oh, and then of course every individual has the same right as any other under the law. The employee has a right to say for whom he will work, and he can just leave the employment of any employer at any time for any reason. Of course, what we know, if we're listening to this show, is that what he's doing here is using the law to protect the wealthy by asserting a false narrative that both parties in the situation have equal choice in the matter, when that obviously isn't true, because choices are only made possible in relation to one's access to wealth, resources, and power. And if a worker can only work for the employers that are available, And if we rely on an income in order to survive under capitalism, we don't actually have the choice of quitting a job if there aren't other jobs available. That's an illusion, because if we quit, that would be suicide at best and sacrificing our families at worst. So then, that same judge issued a restraining order on July 23rd against 160 strikers from the Marion mill and against Alfred Hoffman, who didn't work at the mill, declaring that all of those people, all 161 people, were legally barred from picketing or congregating on company property. Meanwhile, at the Clinchfield Manufacturing Company, 150 workers were fired from the mill for their affiliation with the union. And because they were fired from the mill, they were evicted from their company-owned housing. The other unionized workers rallied behind their colleagues and demanded their reinstatement, along with their other demands for the reduction in hours that we already talked about. And they also wanted compliance with the state law that required seats for women. And they wanted the company to cooperate with the union on waste management. And so as the union workers exercised their right to collective organizing and bargaining, their organizing around those demands managed to successfully curtail production for around 3 weeks. And over the course of both mills, so now we've got Marion Manufacturing Company and Clinchfield Manufacturing Company. Over the course of both mills' period of closure, strikers were staging several parades in which several hundred workers would carry banners, they would sing, they would have a variety of speakers address the crowd to get them fired up. And I just love this image of joyful rebellion that is rooted in the history of labor organizing. Good trouble, as John Lewis might call it. And labor organizing was also deeply connected to mutual aid, right? Like they depended on mutual aid of each other in order to survive because they didn't have any income coming in, right? So these parades are happening, and in early August, one of the bosses from the Clinchfield mill was arrested after he drove his car into a group of parading women strikers and strike sympathizers. And then after he drove his car into this group, he fired several shots from his shotgun into the air over the crowd. These guys were literally fucking crazy. They were mob bosses. You got a bunch of workers who are supporting each other, coming together to literally fight for the bare fucking minimum. And these greedy capitalist shitheads just get murderous whenever their profits are threatened. So it was early August when that guy got arrested, and it was mid-August when the Clinchfield company just literally told their workforce, y'all don't have any jobs anymore. And that is what unions refer to as a lockout, which is a way for companies themselves to strike back in retaliation against striking workers. So they, fire the workers, but then they also will just shut the doors and be like, oh, you don't want to work until we give you what you want? Too bad. You don't get to work. So around 6 weeks after the initial walkout at the Marion Mill, those first 600 and some striking workers who had walked out in Marion were joined by 1,000 more from the Clinchfield mill. Of course, what this meant was that the entire labor force, those 1,000 folks from Clinchfield, were also going to be forcibly removed from their housing that was so conveniently owned by the manufacturing company. And so on August 16th, that same old anti-union rascal, Sheriff Adkins, and 8 of his deputies showed up at the Clinchfield Mill Village to evict those former employees from their company houses. And when they showed up, they were met with around 400 folks who reportedly yelled, "There's not enough deputies in McDowell County to throw us out of our homes. Get out of here and never come back," as they surrounded the officers and ultimately ended up forcing them to leave and abandon their mission of evicting those families. Those 1,600 some workers represented around 200 families from the Marion and Clinchfield mills, and those families were being given assistance with food, clothing, and medical attention from the United Textile Workers and the American Friends Service Committee, and they were receiving that assistance for months while the closure of the mills were maintained. And despite the restraining orders that had been put in place to prevent picketing, they still maintained a presence outside the Marion plant day and night. The strikers would trade picketing shifts, which were 8 hours long. They built small sheds and fastened the sheds to the fences around the manufacturing plants so that the strikers could stay out there and be protected from the elements. Younger strikers would carry water around the picketing lines. Coffee would be prepared every 3 hours. And they kept this up for weeks until after the Clinchfield cotton mill had been on limited operations for so long, they were finally planning to resume full-time operations again. But that change would be accompanied by a 10% reduction in wages, which is just outrageous. That is higher than a cost of living adjustment would be in today's era. Like, your boss is going to be like, oh, I'll give you like a 1% cost of living adjustment. But bosses back then are like, oh, well, we're going to resume full-time operations and we're going to cut your wages by 10%. That's so crazy. So strike leaders announced that they were going to have a heavy presence in the picket line at the plants, and that any effort to break the strike by using non-union labor would be met with resistance. So I didn't find much on the actual first attempt to reopen the mill, but apparently it wasn't successful, because I did find information about a second attempt to open the mill, which was met with an equal level of resistance from the union workers. And when the workers refused to withdraw from the picket line and allow the scabs to enter the mill, the local judge called for 2 military units from the North Carolina National Guard to be brought into Marion. So again, using the institutions of the white supremacist capitalist state to protect the interests of those with wealth and power. And it's just so, like, I mean, for somebody like me, it's like, what is the line of thought? Like, I don't even understand, right? Because it's like, okay, you see that you have, first, the beginning of the story, like 600 some workers who are mad about the conditions of their workplace. And you got this one guy who's profiting off of the conditions of this workplace. And so you as a judge, you're like, oh, well, I'm going to just use legal force to prevent more than 100 people from acquiring better working conditions that they are all asking for. And then when those numbers grow, I'm going to call in for the National Guard instead of just using my position to get this one person to give in to the demands of these hundreds of people. Like, the math isn't mathing, as the kids say. Some of the old timers in the area reflected that they couldn't remember another time that soldiers had been called to McDowell County for any purpose other than a good time parade. So around 110 National Guardsmen were posted up at the courthouse, and they weren't actually sent into the mill villages for a little while they were staying in the courthouse. And this meant that they were basically useless when it came to preventing like several outbreaks of violence in the villages. In particular, in the Clinchfield village, there was one situation where non-union workers, so scabs, were arrested after a union picketer was seriously injured by knives. And one of those same scabs was also charged with drawing a pistol on several women along the picket line, which forced the union men to to literally chase him into the sheriff's hands. The National Guardsmen ultimately weren't even called into action at the picket lines before an agreement was somehow made between the union labor and the mill officials, making way for negotiations to be facilitated by a fella named Judge Townsend. Now, the following days of negotiations lasted for a while, but ultimately they collapsed in deadlock around one issue, which was the issue of non-discrimination against workers who were members of the union. The union only wanted protections for their members. They didn't want the company to fire or otherwise retaliate against workers who were members of the union, and rightfully so. Like, if you're going to sign up for this organization to have protections and collective bargaining, you don't want the workplace to retaliate against you for pursuing those protections. So the company, of course, was not about to give them equal consideration to the scabs, who they considered to be loyal workers. So company officials eventually withdrew from the negotiations entirely and just refused attempts at further arbitration over this issue. While these negotiations are taking place, the violence and the tensions are growing in the mill villages, and reports of explosions, dynamite explosions throughout the mill village started popping up all over the place, on people's porches that were both union members and non-union members, factory areas. And it's not clear to me, actually, if these explosions were at the hands of the business operators, the mill operators, or if they were at the hands of the union workers, because of course, naturally, both parties accused the other of being behind the real violence. But two men who were members of the union received shotgun wounds, while another member of the union was shot at by a man who they don't know who he was because he escaped by catching a freight train, reportedly. And meanwhile, on the other hand, the windows in the home of one of the mill officials were shot out, and the windows of the company store were also broken. So residents on both sides were very anxious. And because of this, well, I should say, the Committee of Business Owners in Marion used this to their advantage and requested a declaration of martial law. Here we go again. We heard this in our West Virginia stories, in the town, and the return of the troops. I have to remind myself of the timeline because ADD, and it's easy for me to lose track of actually how much or how little time has passed in a series of events like this. So to remind myself and all of us, it was 1929, like spring, early summer, when articles were being written. July 11th, that the 600 some workers walked out of the Marion mill. And now it is the end of August. And so, like, not even 2 months, and we have already had the National Guard called into town one time. And at this point, we've got the business owners again requesting more National Guard troops and a declaration of martial law. So all of this within 2 months of that first walkout. And at the end of August, a confrontation took place in the Clinchfield Mill Village, where more than 400 folks gathered at the entrance of the mill and the mill village, and refused to allow the sheriff to enter in order to make way for the scabs who were there to take their jobs. And so the sheriff left to go get backup, and while he was gone, the strikers surrounded the other officers and just started brandishing sticks and rocks and whatever weapons they could make or whatever they had on hand. And so by the time the sheriff finally returned, he just took his men and got the hell out of there while it was raining down bricks and rocks. As a result of that conflict, the National Guardsmen were finally sent into the Marion Manufacturing Company and the Clinchfield Mill, where they, in order to get into the property, had to literally push their way through lines of striking workers. And once they got through those workers, they took up arms on the property with their machine guns pointed out of the plants. So they're taking up arms in the plants at the end of August, and then in the early days of September, an agreement finally was met as the mill officials finally conceded to operating on the 55-hour work week, which was all the workers had wanted this entire time. Well, it's not all they wanted, and actually not all of the demands of the union were fulfilled, but the workers who had been on strike these last couple months felt that the settlement wasn't a defeat, and they intended to return to work for both the Clinchfield and Marion plants. And the troops were called out of the company buildings. And the presence of the troops in Marion during that time cost the state a total of almost $30,000. So for people who care about their fake money so much, they're willing to spend a lot of that fake money to suppress labor organizing from any potential success. They consider that an investment. But this story, I think I've probably called a lot of our stories a roller coaster, but this story is really a roller coaster because within days of making that agreement, hundreds of those union workers found themselves unemployed, and leaders of the union efforts were blacklisted by the officials of neighboring mills where their employment was being sought. So they're like fired from the mills where they used to work, where they had organized their unions. And then those mills, the mill owners, I should say, talk to their buddies at all of the surrounding mills, and they're like, don't hire these guys. So that's basically the death sentence, essentially, under capitalism. So at the same time, nearly 60 union members were being indicted by the McDowell County grand jury on charges of rioting and inciting a rebellion. Alfred Hoffman, remember him from like 20 or something minutes ago, and 3 of his comrades were on trial as a result of this indictment. And while they were in jail, one of his partners in crime, literally, solved his way out of the local McDowell County jail and escaped, which forced the judge to declare a mistrial due to like unlawful activity or something like that, and schedule another trial for November. So they're just pushing it back at this point. So eventually Hoffman, though, as a result of the trial in November, was convicted along with the 3 others on charges of rioting and resisting officers. And Hoffman was fined $1,000 and sentenced to a month in jail, and his 3 comrades were given 6 months each in jail. But before Hoffman and his comrades were convicted and sentenced, after all of this rioting had been taking place throughout August and September, on the morning of October 2nd, an unexpected spontaneous walkout took place. Another unexpected spontaneous walkout, again at the Marion Manufacturing Company. And the sheriff and his deputies showed up trying to intending to forcibly disperse the strikers, which resulted in a fight that ensued. And at some point in time, hundreds of shots started being fired into the crowd by the law enforcement officers. Not much has changed, huh? At the end of this fight, 6 union members were killed, and at least a couple dozen had been injured by the gunfire of law enforcement. Now, the only two eyewitnesses who were there during this event that were not either members of the unionized workers or anti-union folks were two reporters who worked for the Asheville Citizen. And according to those two reporters, most of the individuals who were wounded were shot from behind as they were running away from tear gas that had been exploded by Sheriff Adkin. So, as a result of their eyewitness statements, an investigation was called and probable cause was found against 8 McDowell County officers. Towards the end of October, around 40 families between the two mill villages of East Marion and Clinchfield were issued eviction notices, calling on them to evacuate their company-owned housing in the mill village. Get the hell out. Those families were the families of the blacklisted strikers and were referred to as undesirables by the company officials in the newspaper articles that I was reading. Some of the National Guard units were charged to remain on duty in the strike zone indefinitely until those families were good and gone. The notices that were issued asked the blacklisted strikers and their families to vacate the company-owned housing in a matter of days, or else they would be confronted with legal enforcement. So I already told you the outcome of Alfred Hoffman and his comrades who were facing trial. What I didn't mention was that during that time period, a total of 119 people were facing trial on a variety of charges, including the 8 deputy sheriffs and special deputies who were facing charges of murder. 53 of the defendants, including Alfred Hoffman, were facing charges related to disorderly conduct back in the August situation. 37 strikers were facing charges connected to the massacre of the union members on October 2nd and catalyzing those events. So I don't know the outcome of all 119 people. What I do know is that Alfred and his 3 comrades were sentenced to jail time, a minimum of 30 days for Hoffman and then up to 6 months for his friends, for supposedly, starting riots and resisting officers in events that involved no deaths whatsoever. Jail time and fines for no deaths whatsoever. Reminder. And what I also know is that 4 days before Christmas, the officers who were involved in an event where eyewitnesses saw them fire into a crowd and kill 6 people and wound at least 24, 4 days before Christmas, those officers were acquitted of their charges after 22 hours of jury deliberation. This episode started out as a exploration of another situation of labor suppression, but this is kind of an impromptu reflection on my part around how now it's turned into an opportunity to bring up the fact that the police brutality and murder of people of color and marginalized communities as a means of protecting white supremacist capitalism and maintaining the status quo is not a new phenomenon. Ultimately, police and military forces have always been used for one thing, and that is to produce, protect, and maintain a profit for a very small group of people who are in proximity to wealth and power. And this also certainly wasn't the end of Marion and McDowell County's experiences with brutality towards collective organizing attempts. In 1937, the Charlotte Observer published a statement. Don Lewis, who was president of the AFL at the time, basically saying, like, enter at your own risk. The literal words were, after the 1929 experiences of labor organizers in Marion, we would venture the statement that any labor organizer who would dare to visit Marion would do so at serious risk to his own person. Then in the 1940s, the International Upholsterers Union of the AFL asserted that a reign of terror existed in Marion at the Drexel Furniture Company's plant after 2 successive beatings occurred of their union organizers. Then in the 1950s, the Textile Workers Union of America asked for an investigation into efforts dedicated to defeating their union's organizing drive at the American Thread Company's Sevier plant, which was 9 miles from Marion. Apparently, the local newspaper in that situation, the McDowell News, was accused of being in cahoots with the American Thread Company execs. The union provided proof that they had basically just given the news publisher their addresses for their employees, and then the news publisher had used those addresses with their consent to send letters offering to provide them with news services for free for several months as a, quote, public service, unquote, to them, and also added that he was sure that if they knew all the facts, they would see no need to vote for the union. And then after offering to provide the paper for free to those residents who were employees of the American Thread Company, in their editions of the newspaper, multiple times, they just basically used that whole platform to slam the union. And in fact, they used the newspaper in one edition to announce the formation of a citizens group that was dedicated to protesting the prospects of the formation of a union and the presence of any professional union organizers within the bounds of McDowell County. That same newspaper edition also carried a full-page advertisement from that citizens group and a front-page editorial that basically just slandered the union officials. So between the media, law enforcement, military forces, the wealthy fucking elite have done everything in their power and used every tool that they can possibly think of to suppress any attempts to organize against their interest of profit. And I always knew that was true, but seeing it just literally in these newspaper sources about places where I have lived, my hometowns in Western North Carolina, is just almost surreal in a way. It's just so, it's affirming in a really tragic kind of way. And I think on that note, that's probably a good place to wrap up. I doubt that I have done this story justice as someone who was reading about it for the first time over the last few days. I'm really excited to have a local come on and dig into this more later on. And I really appreciate y'all being so curious to learn about these types of stories and giving me the opportunity to dig into it myself and share these stories with you. But before I wrap up, I think it's actually really important for me to name in the heaviness of this episode that the reason that they use all of their force and all of their might and all of these different shapes is because they know that our collective organizing is a real threat to them. And that is the ultimate threat to the systems that they have built and the profit on which they depend. And what that means for us, if we're listening to this and we're feeling like, well, this is really heavy and doesn't have a great ending, what that means for us is that the ending isn't actually written yet. Like, we're still living this in the modern day, and how we contribute to this ongoing story of struggle towards liberation, how we contribute is a choice that we get to make. We get to show up. We get to organize together. We get to invite others to organize with us in this journey. And it will never be easy, and we will always be met with resistance, and we will know that their resistance means they are afraid, and they should be. So that is exactly the note I want to leave us on, because I'm going to be back in just a few days with our friends from Power, specifically our friend Grace from Power, and we are going to talk about what it looks like to collectively organize right here, right now, in the present moment, and you have an opportunity to contribute to that. So don't forget to tune into that bonus episode. It's going to be a surprise as to when it drops, mostly because I don't actually know when yet, but we'll find out together. In the meantime, don't forget to boot, scoot, and boogie over to our Ko-Fi page to support us, or even just follow us over there so you can keep track of updates. You can also support us by following us on social media. We're at Rednecks Rising on basically all platforms. You can also head over to our link tree, linktr.ee/rednecksrising, where we have links to all of the above, social media, Ko-Fi, and more. And don't forget to subscribe on whatever streaming platform you use so that you can keep up with all of our episodes and get alerts and never miss a thing. And before we go, we have to know, what is the answer to today's trivia question?
So our question for today was, what is the largest tunnel in the Appalachian Mountains? And the answer is the Big Walker Mountain Tunnel in Virginia. It's located in Bland County, and at the time in 1972, it was the largest interstate project that the state of Virginia had ever taken, over 4,000 feet long.
That is a very long tunnel indeed. Go Virginia! Longest tunnel in the Appalachian Mountains. Go y'all. All right, and on that note, that wraps us up for today. Lord willing and the creek don't rise. We'll see y'all in a few days with our bonus episode. Take care now, y'all.
Was in Marion, North Carolina, in a little mountain town. 5 workers of the textile in cold blood were shot down. Is there the same old story with the labor